Hello, everybody. Today we are doing male and female miscommunication. You can tell by this title that this is actually a very old text, and I'll explain at the end why I chose this text in particular. But this is a pretty important article, and so please make sure to read this before you watch this. Let's see. All right. So, what are some differences in the communication methods and language between opposite sex? How are they the same or different among males or females, right? So basically, I'm asking you, what are the difference between the way that women communicate and the way that men communicate? What are types of things are more acceptable? What are things are less acceptable? Within the text, actually, they talk about a lot. But there are some other things that people don't really talk about. In terms of like even at like a younger age, right, we are taught to communicate in a certain way as a girl, as a boy, and we're really going to talk about this lecture. So, cross-sex communication studies often discuss communication between men and women in both flirty and non-flirting situations. Why does this occur, right? So, the whole premise of this article is to understand why do men and women miscommunicate. We have been, together for a long time. We live in the same country, in the same state, in the same city, in the same neighborhoods, in the same district, sometimes even in the same house, and yet there's still miscommunication between women and men. Why does this occur, right? And this is kind of the overall topic of this article. Now, within the article, there are some features here, men's and women's features. The women's features are that women have a greater tendency to ask questions. They do more of the shit work in maintaining social interaction. Women tend to use more positive minimal responses. Women tend to use silent protests after they have been interrupted or received a delayed minimal response. And finally, women tend to explicitly acknowledge other speakers by using words like you and we. Okay. Now, these are all kind of similar in the sense that women tend to be a little more they put a lot of effort into making sure the conversation is smooth, right? So, for example, doing more of the shit work and maintaining social interaction is a very, very good summary of what women do usually in conversation, right? And that leads to things such as having a greater tendency to ask questions, also using more positive minimal responses, right? So positive minimal responses are basically saying like, mm-hmm, yes, nodding your head. Those are all the kind of like acknowledgments. These are considered positive minimal responses. This next one is a little harder to see, but using silent protest or they've interrupted or received a delayed minimal response, notice that they do not tend to be like, hey, like I'm talking, right? They don't say that. They will instead of do the opposite, they would be like, okay, you don't want to listen to me, I'm just gonna be quiet and just not say anything. And also it's very interesting, this last one is that women tend to include everyone in a conversation when they're using words like you and we, so that everyone that's in the immediate conversation is included, right? So, um, interesting features here. The interesting thing, well, we'll talk about the end, but it's very interesting because I also think, at least from my classes, that people tend to agree that this is still a thing, right? Remember, this article was written in the 1980s. Talk about that later. But okay, moving on to men's features, right? Men are more likely to interrupt the speech of their partner. They're more likely to challenge or dispute, more likely to ignore the comments of the other speaker, and more likely to control or steer the topic of conversation by any introducing. And men make more direct declarations of fact or opinion. Again, these are traits that are pretty well received by the classes. They agree that this is a thing. But yeah, they all kind of like, well, I don't want to spoil it, but basically, they follow kind of a line of um of sometimes of prioritizing um confidence or whatever when they're speaking, right? So like for example, interrupting, challenging, ignoring, direct declarations. These are all attributes of what men consider to be confidence. It's very interesting though, because these are very different, obviously, than the women's features. All right, moving on. So those are some of the features that we have as men and women. And again, I mean, I know these aren't perfect, but they're pretty close to what still goes on today. And so later on in the article, it talks about what have other researchers thought. Okay, so this is not necessarily specifically about male to female miscommunication. Sorry, this is not specifically about the current authors. It is about what other authors and other researchers have already researched in terms of this topic, right? So most previous research revolves around the social power personalities of men and women. This system gives the power. Men's dominance in society, men's dominance in conversation parallels their dominance in society. Norms of appropriate behavior gives power and interactional control to men while keeping away from women. So there's two things here, right? When other researchers have looked at this topic, right? A lot of them kind of talk about how, men have a lot of power in society, and so when they have a conversation, it reflects that, right? That's kind of like, the main thing. The other thing is, what is considered acceptable as feminine or masculine in conversation. When you are more feminine conversation, which is the societal standards for what is the feminine, it takes away power from the conversation. So if you are acting ladylike in your conversation, you are literally taking power away from yourself if using these rules, right? So these are kind of the two things that research focuses on in the past, okay? So while that might be true, a very few of the authors or researchers really take into consideration why this happens, right? So why this happens, right? So what does this author believe? This author believes that cultural differences between men and women in their friendly conversation, their rules for engaging in it, and probably most importantly, their rules for interpreting it. American men and women come from different social linguistic subcultures, having learned to do things with words into conversation, so that when they attempt to carry conversations with one another, cultural miscommunication results, right? So what this is basically saying is that as we grow older, as girls and boys, we are taught to communicate a certain way. And because of that, we are from social linguistic subcultures. That's just a fancy way of saying we are not from what we would consider completely different cultures, but we are different. That we are a boy in, let's say, American, New York, Brooklyn culture. We are a girl in American, New York, Brooklyn culture. And so when we are a boy, when we are a girl, we end up being taught different ways to communicate. Okay? It's that simple. Okay? Now, while we grow older, though, we are taught that, certain things are the right way to communicate and they're wrong way to communicate. And because we're being taught different things, miscommunication will occur. Okay. Now, when men and women have different experiences and operate in different social contexts, they tend to develop different genres of speech and different skills for doing things with words. Now, this is exactly what I'm talking about, right? So as you grow older, right, you are learning different types of words associated with being a boy or a man or a girl or a woman, right? And as we get older, right, it is no surprise that we will have different language and thus we will learn different things. So one of the interesting things that I thought of when I read this, right, was the dating, right? Dating in America is very different than it is in other countries. It's very different in New York City even than other places. It's different everywhere. But, I was thinking to myself, in high school, I went to prom, right? In high school, I went to, whatever, autumn ball, whatever stuff they had, junior prom, all this other stuff. I thought about that, and actually, those were the building blocks to teach me how to date in college and then post college, right? Those things, those experiences kind of lead into each other. Okay. So without that kind of experience, I wouldn't know a lot of things about romantic relationships today, right? And they all kind of lead into each other. Now, let me give you a good example. So for example, for prom, what do the boys usually do? They usually have this pretty big, like, asking a girl out to prom, kind of like, it's not a skit, but like a setup, right? Where it's like, maybe they prom with a question mark, in roses, or they might have someone like, you know, I don't know, bring a sign over. So something kind of dramatic, right? Now, I don't know if you noticed, but this is very similar to like how someone would ask someone to be married, to get married, right? And then, of course, when you're getting ready for prom as a boy or as a girl, you're doing different things. I guarantee you that if you are a girl, you do not know what the measurements for a men's tuxedo is, right? Do you know where to get a men's tuxedo? Maybe, maybe not. Most likely not. While women have to do a lot of things that men have no idea what to do, right? So, like, for example, buying a dress. Men have no idea where they're going to buy, where to buy a dress. They don't know what measurements are important. They don't know where to get their hair done or to get their nails done. whatever, right? And let's say a lot of people in my school like, called limos or car service or whatever. Maybe the girls might not know what the car service is if the men organize it. The main point is through our different experiences as men and women or boys and girls, we end up learning different types of language that informs our experiences, right? And so it is no surprise that there are a lot of things that girls go through that boys don't know anything about, and a lot of things that men go through women that know nothing about, right? So we're literally developing different language depending on what we're doing in our day-to-day lives. Now, another interesting example is this is a little more recent, is on TikTok. Um, God, what's that trend called? It's like, oh, pads with wings, right? I think you just look this up. And the joke is, the girlfriends or wives ask their husbands slash boyfriends to get like pads with wings. And what they ended up getting was, like, yeah, it's correct, the pad, the period pad for women, which is great. But then they got them a box of buffalo wings, right? And so the challenge is basically, does your boyfriend slash partner know like what pads with wings are? And so for those that don't know, pads with wings are a special type of period pad that have like the little tips on the sides. But that's an interesting example, right? Because I know it's a joke, but realistically, the reason why men don't know what pads with wings are is because obviously they haven't been exposed to this language, right? And that's the point of with this particular slide, right? Is that as we grow older, we're doing different things as boys and girls and men and women, and because of that, we develop different types of language. Okay. Now, because of this kind of realization by the authors, right? The way that the article or the thing that the article relates it to is ethnic miscommunication. Okay. So conversation is a negotiated activity. It progresses in large part because of a shared assumption about what is going on. So when we're speaking to one another or when we're having any kind of linguistic discourse or any kind of language exchange, you'd be surprised how much you already know is going to happen, right? So if I'm talking to you through an email, you kind of already know this is about school. I'm not going to ask you what you ate for dinner, right? If you are, even if you're at a bus stop or a train stop, right, in Manhattan, and someone with like a map is looking around and they're walking up to it, you can probably assume that they're going to ask you about directions, right? Now, are you going to be 100% on the dot all the time? No, not exactly, but you will be close. And a lot of our conversations have that understanding already. Now, the reason why the author compares men and women miscommunicating to interethnic miscommunication is because it is essentially the same thing, right? So the example they gave was the which I call it the Indian gravy example, right? So differences in cues resulted in systemic miscommunication over whether a question was being asked, whether an argument was being made, whether a person was being rude or polite, whether a speaker was relinquishing the floor or interrupting, whether and what a speaker was emphasizing, whether interactings were concerned, angry, or indifferent. Okay. Now, this sounds pretty obvious, right? So the example I have here is um there's an Indian woman and she's serving gravy, right? Now, the what ended up happening was because this Indian woman does not understand the kind of the linguistic standards of the UK or Britain, right? She would serve gravy in a certain way that was interpreted as impolite, right? So if in American English I was to serve you gravy, I'd be like gravy, right? Smile, my pitch or whatever would inflect, or there'd be an inflection in my tone. You're right. Okay, so that sounds very polite. However, if I were to go like this, gravy, right? That would be seen not in the same way. Now, it might not seem super rude or polite or whatever, but there's obviously a difference there. Okay. Now, the reason why this is interesting though is because at this particular time, India and Britain were not having such a great relationship. So there were already kind of cultural clashes existing outside of, day-to-day stuff or outside of person-to-person stuff. There's political stuff. But anyways, what should have been just like, hey, this woman is from India, and so she doesn't understand what it is to be polite in the UK. She has a different set of linguistic standards. It went from that basically not knowing, what it is to be polite in the UK, to like, oh, you know what? They hate Britain. They have no manners. They're terrible people. They want to take over Britain. They hate British everything. So again, to say it in this slide, instead of understanding that it was okay, a linguistic difference, the difference in communication was seen as a personality clashes or interpreted through the perspective of racial stereotypes, which made bad relations worse. So basically, because of the context, which is very interesting, because of the context of everything, right? Because of what was going on politically and in the background, instead of chalking it up to being like, oh, hey, like, she just literally does not understand how to be polite in our culture, it went from that to, hey, she hates British people. Or like, hey, all Indians hate British people. Or hey, all Indian people don't have manners, right? And this seems like a ridiculous thing, but it happens a lot in our society all the time. It happens a lot everywhere all the time, right? Where you think things are constantly uh depending on the situation, you might assign certain types of judgments to it because of the political situation, right? So my example was, let's say you live in an area where there's no Mexican people, and then you're constantly being fed information that Mexicans always steal things. And then, you might call DoorDash and you just happen to notice, oh, the guy is like, Mexican. And instead of like, 8 pieces of beef, there's like seven. In your head, you're gonna be like, oh, I bet you he stole it, right? Now, that might not necessarily be the case. That might be the restaurant gave you 7 pieces of beef instead of eight, whatever it is, right? But you might think that way because of the context that's given to you. That is similar to what is happening in this situation. Now, what is extra interesting in this is that if you then relay that to men and women miscommunicating, it becomes even more impactful. And we're going to talk about that toward the end. So, how can this be applied to male-female miscommunication, right? So these are some couple examples that where this kind of really applies, right? So minimal responses such as nods, comments like yes and mean different things to men and women. For women, it means something like "I'm listening, please continue." For men, it means something similar to "I agree with you" or "I follow your argument." Okay, these are two, kind of similar things, but they're very different. Now, by following this example, men always think women are agreeing, but then conclude it is impossible to tell what a woman thinks. Women get upset with men who never seem to be listening, right? And this happens a lot of time and with all types of couples and interactions, right? People believe like, or sorry, woman, like this has me, my girlfriend, like, I'm not looking at her, I'm looking at my phone and she's talking and she like stops talking because she thinks I'm not listening. I'm like, yeah, I'm listening. Like, what were you gonna say? Because I'm not giving her that type of or yes, all right. While on the other side of that, this doesn't happen necessarily to me, but I've seen people where, men are talking and the woman's like nodding and saying yes or whatever, and the guy thinks, oh, like she agrees with me, but in reality, she wasn't saying that. She was just acknowledging that the man was talking. But that then leads to men thinking that women are always agreeing, and then they don't agree, and then they think like, oh, like I don't even know what women are thinking. And on the flip side of that, right, women think that men are never listening, but in reality, they just don't do the minimal responses, right? And so while this is a kind of like a fun common example, if you compare that to the internet ethnic miscommunication that we talked about, it is kind of the same thing, right? Where this Indian woman again was just having trouble showing politeness or whatever when she's serving gravy, and it was basically chalked up to like, oh hey, she hates being in Britain, right? So it can slip down this slope very quickly. Great. So now, so that's one part of it, right? Now, moving on to the second part of it. So honestly, the main purpose of me showing you this article is to show you how cultural our understanding of communication is, right? What is correct, or how we are taught to communicate as a boy or a girl is very different. An easy example is, I see this all the time in elementary schools where a boy like falls down and is crying. And at first the teacher's like, oh, you okay, John? You okay? And the boy keeps on crying. Like the teacher would be like, okay, John, we're good. Like let's get ready to go. While with the girl, they'll give them a little more time before they are really asked to stop crying, so to speak, right? So that's a very easy example. And we're taught small things like this all throughout our lives. Okay, but anyways, the understanding of your communication method, your language being cultural is nothing super significant. That's something that's pretty obvious in linguistic anthropology. However, this particular part is very special to this article, right? So let's talk about it. By the time we are adults, we possess a wide variety of rules for interacting in different situations. Different sets of these rules were learned at different times and in different contexts. Not just gender, think about power relations, think about making friends, romantic relationships, right? So again, as we grow older into adults, right, we are not only learning like specific words, we're learning how to use those words in certain situations. We're learning about different contexts to use these words, right? Like, like again, power dynamics, like if you're a boss or a worker or a mom or a dad versus a kid versus a professor, all this other stuff. But also think about dating too. Think about how different it is to communicate when you're romantically interested in someone versus when you're just talking to someone else. Okay. Now, what's interesting though is that these patterns, right, are really obtained strongly these patterns are obtained gradually, right? But what's really interesting about this article is that they found that from ages 5 to 15 is when the skill is developed. These times are also when they are most segregated with their own sex. So, sorry. So, how do these skills form is members from each sex are learning self-consciously to differentiate their behavior from that of the other sex and to exaggerate these differences. Because they learn these gender-specific cultures from their age mates, children tend to develop stereotypes and extreme versions of adult behavior patterns. Boys and girls learn to use language in different ways because of the very different social context in which they learn how to carry friendly conversation. So let me break this down for you. What is interesting is that when people are learning what it is to be a man or a woman, an adult man or woman, they are trying to differentiate themselves, right? Whether you're a man from a woman or for a woman from a man, with with growing older. Now, what's interesting though is that this kind of understanding of the opposite sex is developed from ages 5 to 15. Now, why is that significant? That is significant because who are you usually hanging out with from age 5 to 16? You're hanging out with your own gender usually. So basically, you're learning how it is to be a woman from a bunch of 5 to 15-year-old boys, and you're learning how it is to be a man from a bunch of 5 to 15-year-old girls. So you can understand where there are a lot of exaggerations in the image that we create as young people of adults. Okay. So, oops. So the main point of this is, I guess I didn't write it down. I thought I did, but it's okay. The main point, or sorry, not the main point. One of the unique points of this article is that what the author is saying is, in order to become an adult, you need to overcome stereotypical and exaggerated images of the opposite gender, right? So basically, what it's saying is, when you're from ages 5 to 15, you develop this very, very exaggerated version of what it is to be an adult of the opposite gender. So for me, you'd be a woman. Like I am learning what a woman is and the boundaries and what it really means to be a woman from other 5 to 15-year-olds. And so what this article is saying is, in order for me to become an adult, I need to overcome those kind of stereotypical and exaggerated characteristics that I developed as a young person. Okay. So those are kind of the two things I want you to pay attention to in this article, right? One is that our the miscommunicate the communication patterns that we develop are from social linguistic subcultures, meaning that as we are growing up as boys and girls, we learn how to communicate differently. And number two, which is specifically from this article, right? As we become older and become adults, we need to overcome exaggerated stereotypes of the opposite gender. Okay. So some examples of miscommunication is questions are viewed by women as a part of conversational maintenance, while men view them as requests for information. When speaking, it is important for women to explicitly acknowledge the past topic / make a connection, while for men, there is no such rule, sometimes intentionally ignoring preceding comments. Number three, verbal aggressiveness is interpreted as personal, negative, and destructive by women, while men view it as an organizing structure for conversation. Number four, topic for men is narrowly defined and adhered to until finished, and shifts occur abruptly. Women, however, develop the topic progressively and shifts gradually. These two systems interpret side comments very differently. And finally, problem sharing tend to produce a reassurance by women, while men respond to solutions by advice, being an expert in measuring their audience, right? These are some very clear examples that I hope, that probably you relate to. Now, so these are some other takeaways from this article. Rules from interpreting conversation are culturally determined. There may be different perceptions on what is happening in particular conversation. We must be careful because the participants might not share cultural rule sets. So as we learn through this lecture, right, when we are growing up as boys and girls, we are learning different types of rules for conversation. So it is no surprise that when certain conversations occur, there's confusion that happens, right? Different types of interaction lead to different ways of speaking. Friendly conversation, service encounters, flirting, teaching, and polite formal interaction are all different. Heteroglossia, if you remember that. Even friendly conversation is different depending on how participants may define friends. While most people focus on the ways in which people learn their cultural rules for speaking during interaction, this article suggests that it's important to also emphasize people must overcome their previous cultural training to communicate to the opposite gender, right? So that's the one we talked about at the end. Now, again, big takeaways here is that one, the way we learn to communicate is through social linguistic subcultures, right? Again, as a boy, as a girl, we are taught to communicate differently. And then number two, which is the last point on this slide, is that in order to become an adult and to communicate whatever fluently or whatever, we need to overcome our previous cultural training. We need to overcome our previous exaggerated stereotyped images of the adult of the opposite gender. Okay. So now let me pull this full circle, right? What are some differences in communication methods and language between opposite sexes? One thing I want to emphasize here is, if you read through all of those different sections, right? The features, the world of boys, world of girls, all the different sections, you'll notice that actually, and even in this conversation, a lot of the attributes are the same as they are today. Like women and men, boys and girls can both relate to these characteristics. And you might think, so what? The reason why it's important is because this article was written like super long ago, right? Let me ask you a question. If I were to ask you, are men and women are understandings of gender, men and women, very different from what they were 50 years ago? You would definitely say absolutely yes. And I would say absolutely yes. But what's interesting is these attributes are still very prevalent today. So then that leads to the question, are men and women really that different from 50 years ago? I don't know. But it does show that whenever cultural changes occur, it is always built off of previous things, right? So even if some of this stuff might seem a little strong, it's still relevant. Why is that? Because our current understanding of being a man or a woman is still very much built off of these previous understandings of what being a man or woman is as well. And that's kind of why I chose this article. This article seems super old. Even the use of male and female is a little bit outdated. Because if this was termed accurately today, it'd be men and women. And so the reason why I picked this though is that even though this article is so freaking old, sorry, this is very relevant to how women and men communicate today. And you have to keep that in mind because it may seem like things have changed a lot from the past. But if you really look back at it, things have changed. The things have changed, but it's not as dramatic as you might think it is. Okay. That's pretty much it. Yeah. If you have any questions, just please shoot me an email at raymond.fong@kvcc.cuny.edu.